In June 1940, the world watched as France fell to Germany. The French army, proud and strong, had been crushed by the speed of the German invasion. Paris, the heart of France, was occupied, and the French government signed an armistice with Adolf Hitler. Across the Channel, Britain was now alone. Its allies had been defeated, and the Germans believed Britain would soon surrender too. But something remarkable happened. Instead of giving up, Britain decided to fight on. For many French civilians, this news brought mixed feelings. Some were filled with shame and sadness, knowing their nation had given up while Britain still resisted. Others felt hope again, believing that maybe freedom could return one day. They gathered secretly around radios to listen to the voices coming from London. Winston Churchill's speeches carried across the airwaves, telling them the fight was not over. Those words gave strength to a nation living under the weight of occupation. Life under German control was dark and uncertain. Streets were patrolled by soldiers, and fear was everywhere. People learned to stay quiet because one wrong word could bring punishment. French newspapers printed German propaganda, saying Britain would soon fall and that resistance was useless. But deep inside, many civilians did not believe it. They remembered the bravery of the British soldiers at Dunkirk, how they had escaped under heavy fire to continue the fight. That memory became a light in the darkness. It was proof that courage still existed. Some French people began to pass quiet messages of support to Britain. Others started to dream of joining the Free French forces that General Charles de Gaulle was forming in London. Even though they could not speak freely, their hearts were with Britain, the last nation standing between Europe and complete tyranny. As months passed, the mood in France began to change. At first, some believed that Germany had brought order after the chaos of war. But as food grew scarce and freedoms disappeared, anger grew. People saw their friends taken away for speaking out or helping the resistance. German flags hung over French buildings, and every day reminded them that their independence was gone. In this time of despair, stories from Britain spread quietly through towns and villages. News that London had survived bombings, that British pilots had stopped the Luftwaffe, lifted people's spirits. The French listened in secret and felt pride again, not only for the British, but for the idea of resistance itself. Britain's struggle became their own. It showed them that even when a nation stands alone, it can still stand with courage. In the small cafes of rural France, people whispered about what Britain was doing. They admired how ordinary British citizens endured nights of air raids and loss, yet refused to surrender. For the French living under German rule, these stories became symbols of hope. Young men dreamed of crossing the sea to fight beside the British, while others joined underground groups that passed intelligence to London. Britain's determination inspired them to resist in small ways, hiding Allied pilots, spreading leaflets, or refusing to work for the occupiers. Every act of defiance was dangerous, but it made them feel alive again. Many said Britain was fighting not only for itself, but for the soul of Europe. The courage of one island was awakening the courage of a continent. By 1941, the bond between the British and the French people who refused to submit had grown stronger. The Free French movement, led by Charles de Gaulle, became the symbol of that unity. From London, de Gaulle spoke to his countrymen, urging them not to give up hope. His words reached across the sea through hidden radios, giving strength to farmers, students, and workers who lived under German rule. They knew their government had surrendered, but their spirit had not. Many said that if Britain could endure, then so could France. That belief kept them going through hunger, fear, and loss. Britain's decision to fight on after France's surrender became more than a military choice. It was a message to the world that freedom was worth any cost. As 1941 moved forward, the British fight inspired quiet bravery across occupied France. People who had once felt powerless began to take small risks. Farmers hid radios in barns to listen to the BBC. Teachers secretly taught children that France would rise again. Shopkeepers passed coded messages inside loaves of bread. Every act was dangerous, but it reminded them that freedom still lived in their hearts. Many French civilians admired Britain's unity. They saw how ordinary people refused to bend under bombing, how Londoners rebuilt their homes after every attack. They wondered if their own cities would one day find that same strength. German soldiers sensed the change too. They saw fewer smiles from the locals and more cold silence in the streets. Britain's defiance had become contagious, spreading through whispers and hopes. Even under the shadow of Nazi power, the French people began to believe again that the war was not yet lost. In Paris, life was filled with both fear and quiet pride. German officers walked the streets with confidence, but behind closed doors, the French listened to forbidden radio broadcasts from London. They heard Churchill's voice, steady and defiant, promising that Britain would never surrender. Those words reached deep into the hearts of the French people. Some wept as they listened. They remembered their own lost soldiers and the battles that had ended too soon. Britain's resistance became a reminder of what France had once been. For the first time since the armistice, many Parisians began to say that Germany could not win forever. British courage had turned their sorrow into determination. Even though they could not fight openly, they began to see themselves as part of the same struggle. They waited for the day when France would once again join Britain as an equal partner in freedom's fight. In small villages, far from the cities, the news of Britain's strength traveled slowly but surely. Farmers, priests, and families gathered around dim lamps at night, sharing stories of British bombers striking back and of the Royal Navy keeping the seas open. They admired the way the British people stood together through the Blitz. It was said that in London, when homes were destroyed, neighbors helped rebuild without complaint. That spirit touched the French deeply. It reminded them that unity was stronger than fear. Some villagers began to hide Allied soldiers or escaped prisoners. Others passed on information to the growing resistance networks. They knew the risks, but felt it was the right thing to do. Britain's stand had shown them that courage was not about numbers or weapons, but about never giving up. Across the countryside, quiet acts of bravery began to shape the soul of occupied France. When France had surrendered, many believed that Britain would soon follow. Even Hitler expected the British to make peace after Dunkirk. But as months turned into years, that peace never came. Britain's stubborn refusal to give in became a story of legend. For French civilians who lived under German propaganda, this truth was a source of strength. They began to understand that defeat was not always final. Old men who had fought in the First World War told children about British courage in the trenches. Mothers whispered that the British were still fighting for all of Europe. Hope spread quietly like a fire that could not be put out. The Germans controlled the towns and the roads, but they could not control the minds of the people. Britain's choice to keep fighting had given the French something that the occupation could not take away, the belief that freedom would return. By 1942, the growing resistance in France was no longer a handful of brave individuals. It had become a network that stretched across the country. At its heart was the inspiration that came from Britain's unbroken will. The British were not only fighting on the battlefield, but also dropping leaflets, radios, and supplies into France. This strengthened the connection between the two nations even more. French civilians felt they were no longer alone. They saw that Britain cared and that its people were risking everything to help them. Young French men joined secret cells, sending coded messages to British agents. Women carried information through enemy checkpoints, pretending to be simple travelers. Britain's fight had become their own. Though the enemy still ruled their cities, they had already won something greater, the courage to resist and to believe again in the spirit of freedom that both nations shared. The British broadcasts became a lifeline for those trapped under occupation. Late at night, when the streets were silent and curfews were enforced, French families would gather around hidden radios, turning the volume down to a whisper. The words they heard from London carried warmth and courage. "France has not lost her soul," one announcer said. Those simple words gave people tears and hope. They learned about British victories in North Africa and the Royal Air Force fighting the Luftwaffe in the skies. To many French listeners, it felt as if Britain was fighting not just for itself, but for all of them. The Germans tried to jam the signals and punished anyone caught listening, but that only made the people more determined. In farmhouses, apartments, and basements, those secret broadcasts became a nightly ritual of quiet defiance. Each message from Britain reminded them that the world had not forgotten France, and that someday liberation would come. The courage shown by Britain also reshaped how French civilians viewed their own leaders. When Marshal Pétain signed the armistice, many had believed he was protecting France from destruction. But as time passed and collaboration deepened, people began to see his government as a symbol of surrender rather than safety. They compared his silence to Churchill's fiery speeches, and the contrast was painful. While Britain refused to bow, France's leaders seemed eager to please the occupiers. This realization angered many, especially the young. University students began organizing protests. Workers in factories sabotaged machinery meant for the German army. Even priests spoke against the injustice in coded sermons. Britain's unyielding resistance gave them the moral compass they had lost. It showed them that even in defeat, dignity could be preserved. Slowly, the spirit of rebellion that had been silenced after the armistice began to stir once again across the country. When the Battle of Britain ended with Germany's failure to conquer the skies, French civilians celebrated in secret. For months they had heard that Britain would fall within weeks. But instead, it had stood firm. The sound of German aircraft roaring above France now carried a different meaning. Those same planes had failed to break the British spirit. It was proof that the enemy could be resisted. In occupied Paris, bakeries and markets whispered with excitement. The Germans tried to hide the news, but word traveled fast. The victory of the Royal Air Force became a symbol of hope for the entire continent. To many French citizens, it was the first sign that the tide of the war might one day turn. They realized that Britain's courage was not born from strength, but from determination. That message reached deep into their hearts, planting the first seeds of what would grow into open resistance. By 1943, the resistance networks had matured into a true underground movement. Men and women risked everything to fight for the freedom they no longer had. Their codes, messages, and supply drops all connected back to Britain. Across the countryside, British aircraft flew at night, dropping canisters of weapons, radios, and medicine. Civilians guided them using flashlights arranged in patterns on dark fields. For every successful mission, there was danger from betrayal or capture. Yet the people continued. The idea that Britain had refused surrender became their greatest strength. They believed that if one nation could defy the might of Germany, so could they. The relationship between Britain and the French resistance became one of shared sacrifice and faith. Both fought in different ways, but for the same dream, the dream that freedom would once again return to Europe. Britain's example had awakened a courage that no army could suppress. Even as the war dragged on and the suffering deepened, French civilians never forgot Britain's courage. When food was scarce and cities lay in ruins, people found strength in the belief that Britain still fought on. They painted the letter V for victory on walls at night. They whispered the name Churchill as a symbol of hope. Some even kept small flags of Britain hidden in their homes, waiting for the day they could wave them openly. The connection between the two peoples became unbreakable. It was not born from treaties or politics, but from shared endurance. Britain's refusal to surrender gave France the mirror it needed to see its own courage again. Every bomb that fell on London, every soldier who stood on British soil, reminded the French that freedom demanded faith. And that faith, once lost in 1940, had now been reborn among the people who refused to stop believing. By 1944, the story of Britain's defiance had become part of daily conversation in France. Children heard about it from teachers, and families shared stories at meals. Those who had seen Britain stand alone began to compare their own struggles to the courage shown across the Channel. They asked themselves what they could do to resist oppression in their towns and villages. The small acts of rebellion multiplied, hiding radios, sheltering escapees, passing messages to soldiers in hiding. Britain's example had shown them that even a small nation, if determined, could survive against overwhelming odds. It taught them that surrender was not the only option. The morale of ordinary citizens became a quiet, unspoken weapon. Each French person who refused to collaborate, each family that protected those in danger, was inspired by the knowledge that resistance was not futile. Britain had chosen to fight alone, and that choice gave others the courage to follow in their own way, even when surrounded by danger. News from London continued to reach French ears, despite German attempts to block it. Reports of British forces defending their cities, of planes returning after battles, of civilians standing firm, all carried meaning far beyond the Channel. French civilians began to see that courage was contagious. They realized that fighting for freedom was possible even when defeat seemed certain. Those who had once felt hopeless began to act. Farmers provided food for the resistance. Students risked arrest by writing anti-occupation leaflets. Women disguised messages in laundry or letters. Britain's example had shown that action, even in secret, mattered. The knowledge that another country refused to surrender gave French citizens a moral anchor. Even when death or capture was near, hope persisted. It became a quiet rebellion against despair, a way to hold on to humanity when the world had seemed to collapse. Britain's stand was more than a military fight. It became a symbol of courage that transcended borders and inspired ordinary people to face impossible choices with dignity and determination. Families who had fled the North during the early occupation watched Britain with anxious eyes. They saw ships carrying supplies, planes flying over enemy territory, and speeches that rallied a nation. To them, Britain was more than an ally. It was proof that resistance was meaningful. Parents told their children stories about British resolve, using them to teach lessons about courage and sacrifice. Neighbors gathered secretly to listen to broadcasts, discuss news, and plan small acts of defiance. Each day Britain remained free. Each week it continued to fight, strengthened the spirit of the French people. Even those who had initially doubted Britain's ability to resist began to change their minds. The young men and women who joined the resistance later said that it was Britain's refusal to surrender that convinced them that rebellion was possible. It became a moral compass during a time when survival often required compromise and fear ruled hearts. The courage of another nation reminded them that even in darkness, one could act with conscience and bravery. The contrast between France's surrender and Britain's defiance shaped the future of the resistance. Cities that had been quiet under occupation began to see small uprisings. Leaflets appeared, secret meetings multiplied, and escape routes for soldiers and Jews were organized with growing confidence. British victories and speeches became symbols that resistance could succeed. Courage spread quietly, like a fire in dry grass. Ordinary citizens who had once thought survival meant compliance now acted boldly, guided by the example set across the Channel. People who had been silent began to speak in whispers, sharing hope with neighbors and family. Britain's persistence was not just about winning battles. It was about showing that determination and refusal to yield could inspire millions. This inspiration transformed despair into action and fear into courage. It reminded the French people that even under occupation, they were not powerless. By the time the Allies prepared to invade France in 1944, the influence of Britain's fight was undeniable. French civilians had grown from passive observers into participants in the struggle for liberation. Britain's courage had taught them that resistance, though dangerous and slow, was possible. Every hidden radio, every clandestine meeting, every act of defiance was part of a larger story inspired by the refusal to surrender across the Channel. The people who had once despaired over defeat now found hope and reason to fight. Britain's example reminded them that history is shaped not only by generals and soldiers, but by ordinary men and women who refuse to accept hopelessness. By standing alone, Britain had given France the courage to rise again. The story of French civilians' reactions is a testament to the power of example, the strength of hope, and the enduring human desire for freedom, even in the darkest hours. Their voices, actions, and hearts were changed forever by the knowledge that surrender was not inevitable.